In a world that only watches the loud and the lethal, the most dangerous soul in the room is the one you've already forgotten. The Moka Café wasn't just a shop. It was a sanctuary of soft jazz and expensive steam. A place designed to make the powerful feel like they could finally lower their guard. Outside, Seoul's neon pulse screamed with indifferent speed, but inside, the air smelled of roasted beans, cinnamon, and the curated silence of people with secrets to keep. Choi Sung-min sat bathed in amber light that softened his edges, looking less like a predator and more like a man who had finally bought his way into a quiet life. To the business journals, he was the clean-cut visionary behind the city's newest high-rises, a man of iron-pressed suits and impeccable silence. To the shadows of the underworld, he was still the Ghost of Incheon, the man who had paved his way to the top with the bones of those who underestimated his reach. Tonight, however, he wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking at the bottom of a coffee cup he hadn't the heart to drink. Across the floor, Tiana Walker moved through the periphery, a ghost in a white apron. She pushed her mop bucket with a rhythm that felt like clockwork. Slow, steady, and utterly invisible. To the patrons, she was a part of the furniture, a background hum in a life of luxury. She kept her head down, her braided hair tight and controlled, masking the fact that while everyone else was looking at the coffee, she was the only one watching the door. The Moka Café held the kind of stillness that only exists when everyone is trying very hard to appear casual. It was a fortress of polished marble and low-frequency jazz, a place where the clink of a silver spoon against bone china felt like an act of diplomacy. Choi Sung-min sat at the center of it all, a man who had traded the jagged edges of the street for the smooth surfaces of a high society. To the casual observer, he was a masterpiece of stillness. Jaw carved from stone, eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, his dark tattoo peeking from a collar that cost more than a year of Tiana's rent. He was a man who had spent a lifetime building walls, yet here he sat, intentionally vulnerable, courting the dangerous illusion of a quiet life. Tiana Walker understood the architecture of that silence better than anyone. As she moved through the room, she wasn't just cleaning, she was mapping. She knew which floorboards groaned near the service entrance, and which tables offered the clearest line of sight to the street. To the elite patrons, she was a non-entity, a blur of white linen and dark braids, who existed only to erase their spills and disappear. She wore their indifference like a cloak. It was the only way to keep the ghosts of her own past from finding her in the neon glare of Seoul. The air in the cafe was warm, heavy with the scent of roasted beans and the expensive perfumes of people who didn't know what it meant to fight for a meal. Tiana dipped her mop into the bucket, her movements low and grounded, her center of gravity never wavering. She saw the world in angles and exits, a habit she couldn't unlearn. She watched Sung-min from the corner of her eye. He looked like a king in exile, his hands resting flat on the table, fingers motionless. He was trying to be a man of peace, but Tiana could see the tension in his shoulders, the posture of a tiger waiting for the snap of a twig. The bell above the door chimed, a small silver sound that usually signaled another guest seeking warmth. But the air changed instantly. The temperature didn't drop, yet the atmosphere curdled. 3 men stepped in, their presence a jagged tear in the cafe's carefully curated velvet. They didn't look at the menu. They didn't look at the art on the walls. They looked only at the man by the window. The fortress was breached. The illusion of the restaurant died in the second it took for the lead man to reach into his coat. Tiana didn't scream. She didn't drop her mop. She simply stopped being a cleaner and started being a witness to the end of the peace she had worked so hard to find. The clock on the wall, a minimalist circle of brushed gold, ticked toward 9:16 p.m. The jazz had shifted to something slower, a mournful saxophone solo that seemed to anticipate the fracture about to occur. The three men didn't move like patrons. They moved like predators who had already done the math. They fanned out with a practiced, lethal efficiency, cutting off the angles of the room until Choi Sung-min was pinned against the glass of the window, his reflection caught between the rain outside and the steel inside. The lead man, his face a mask of scarred indifference, pulled the first handgun. It was a heavy, matte black weight that looked obscene against the cafe's soft amber lighting. The slide racked with a sound like a bone snapping, sharp, mechanical, and final. Time didn't stop, but it thickened. A socialite at a nearby table drew a sharp, hitching breath, her glass of Chardonnay trembling until it tipped, the wine spreading across the white cloth like a pale, panicked bruise. Sung-min didn't flinch. He remained seated, his hands still flat on the marble, his eyes locking onto the barrel of the gun with the weary patience of a man who had seen his own death, narrated 1,000 times before. 9:16. The lead man rasped, his voice a jagged contrast to the music. The hour the tiger of Bususan finally stops breathing. Across the room, the mop bucket clicked. Tiana Walker had stopped her rhythmic scrubbing. She stood 10 feet away, her body low and balanced, the wooden handle of her industrial mop held loosely in her grip. To the gunman, she was still a ghost, a background detail in their moment of triumph. They didn't see the way her jaw set, or the way her eyes, once dull and subservient, sharpened into flints of ice. They didn't notice that her feet were planted in a stance that had nothing to do with cleaning floors, and everything to do with breaking bones. The lead gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. The hammer fell. The roar of the first shot shattered the sanctuary of the Moka Café. The bullet didn't find Sung-min's chest. It tore through the upholstery of his chair as he threw himself sideways, his movement a blur of black silk. But before the gunman could correct his aim, the air itself seemed to whistle. Tiana moved. She didn't run. She exploded. The heavy wooden staff of the mop swung upward in a vicious, blinding arc, catching the second attacker's wrist just as he raised his weapon. The sound of wood hitting bone was followed by the clatter of a pistol hitting the marble floor. Tiana stepped into the light, the blood from a shattered carafe already staining the chest of her white shirt, her expression so calm it was terrifying. The gangsters looked at the cleaner. For the first time that night, they felt the cold. The transition from invisible servant to lethal variable was so seamless, it felt like a hallucination. The second attacker scrambled for his dropped weapon, but Tiana was already inside his guard. She didn't use the mop like a tool. She used it like a pike, the heavy wooden shaft snapping forward with the weight of her entire body behind it. The blunt end caught the man in the solar plexus, folding him in half, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged, pathetic wheeze. The third gunman, panicked by the sudden collapse of his partner, swung his barrel away from Sung-min and toward the girl in the blood-stained apron. He expected a screaming victim. He found a soldier. Tiana pivoted on the ball of her foot, her center of gravity dangerously low, her movements devoid of the frantic, messy energy of a street fight. Every inch of her was controlled, As the man's finger tightened on his trigger, she stepped into the dead zone, the space too close for a long-barreled weapon to be effective. With a sharp, cracking snap, she broke the mop head off against the edge of a table, leaving her with a 5-foot staff of seasoned oak. She didn't hesitate. The staff whipped through the air, a blur of motion that ended with the sickening thud of wood meeting a temple. The third man's eyes rolled back, his gun firing a harmless round into the ceiling as he collapsed into a heap of expensive suits and shattered pride. The lead gunman, the one with the scarred face, backed away. He was the only one left standing, his weapon trembling as he tried to track a target that wouldn't stay still. He looked at Tiana, her cornrows neat and undisturbed, her eyes locked on his with a terrifying, hollow focus, and then at Sung-min, who had risen from the floor. Sung-min wasn't running for the exit. He stood beside the cleaner, his posture mirroring hers. He didn't look at her with the pity one gives a civilian. He looked at her with the grim recognition of a wolf spotting another of its kind. He adjusted his cufflink, his gaze never leaving the last man standing. "You made a mistake," Sung-min said, his voice a low, melodic threat that cut through the ringing in the room. "You thought there was only one predator in this cafe, but you weren't even looking at the dangerous one." Tiana shifted her grip on the wooden staff, the blood on her shirt beginning to bloom like a dark flower. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence she had cultivated for years had finally broken, and in its place was a storm that had only just begun to blow. The lead gunman's confidence had evaporated, replaced by the frantic, sweating desperation of a man who realized he had brought a knife to a war he didn't understand. He backed toward the door, his handgun jerking between Tiana and Sung-min like a panicked needle on a compass. He was breathing in shallow, jagged gasps, the scent of ozone and spilled espresso filling the air. "Don't move," he hissed, his finger white on the trigger. "I'll kill both of you. I swear to God." He never finished the threat. Until that moment, Choi Sung-min had been a secondary force, a mountain behind the storm of Tiana's movements. But as the gunman's focus wavered, the tiger of Bususan finally showed why he was feared. Sung-min didn't just move, he glided. He closed the distance in 2 predatory strides, his black suit fluttering like a shadow. The gunman fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the room in a blinding strobe. But Sung-min was already gone. He ducked under the line of fire, his hand snaking out to catch the gunman's wrist with a grip that sounded like dry wood snapping. A howl of agony tore through the cafe, but Sung-min didn't stop. He drove his palm into the man's chin, a strike so precise and powerful it lifted the attacker off his feet. As the gunman staggered back, Tiana didn't watch from the sidelines. She sensed the rhythm of the kill. She swept the wooden staff low, catching the man's ankles as he tried to find his footing. He hit the marble floor with a bone-jarring thud, his weapon skittering away across the floor toward the legs of a grand piano. Sung-min stood over the fallen man, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. The light caught the tattoo on his neck, making the ink look like it was writhing. He reached down and gripped the man's collar, hoisting him upward just enough to look him in the eye. "Tell your master," Sung-min whispered, his voice vibrating with a cold, lethal frequency, "that he sent boys to do a monster's job." He didn't wait for an answer. With a single sharp motion, he slammed the man's head back against the floor, silencing him instantly. The cafe fell into a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the hiss of the espresso machine and the distant wail of sirens growing closer. Sung-min stood and straightened his jacket, his breathing barely disturbed. He turned toward Tiana, his dark eyes scanning the blood on her white shirt. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. Two ghosts who had spent their lives hiding, now standing fully exposed in the wreckage of a sanctuary. "Your form is military," he said, his voice stripped of its polished veneer. "But your eyes look like they have seen the end of the world." Tiana didn't lower her staff. "I'm just the cleaner," she replied, though the lie felt thin and fragile between them. The blue and red pulse of sirens began to bleed through the rain-slicked windows, staining the cafe's amber interior with the colors of an ending. The jazz had long since stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a punctured steam wand. Inside the wreckage, the air was heavy, with the metallic tang of blood and the bitter scent of scorched beans. Sung-min looked at the glass door, then back at Tiana. The polished businessman had vanished, replaced by the man who had survived the streets of Busan. "The police in this district are fast, but they're also loud," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If you stay, you become a witness. If you become a witness, you become a target. Your invisibility is dead the moment they take your statement." Tiana looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were white where they gripped the broken mop handle, and her white shirt was a map of crimson stains. She knew he was right. The life she had built, the quiet, the shadows, the safety of being no one, had been dismantled in less than 4 minutes. To stay was to step into a spotlight that would never turn off. "I have a car in the alley," Sung-min continued, stepping closer. He didn't reach for her. He offered a space beside him, a silent acknowledgement of her agency. "I can make you disappear before the first officer crosses that threshold. But once you step into my world, the silence is over." Tiana didn't hesitate. She dropped the wooden staff, the heavy oak clattering against the marble, a final signature on the life she was leaving behind. She grabbed a dark coat from the employee rack, throwing it over her bloodied uniform to shroud the evidence of the storm. They moved together, a synchronized blur of black and shadow, exiting through the kitchen just as the first heavy boots kicked at the front glass. The alleyway was a canyon of brick and cold rain, the air sharp enough to sting. A black sedan sat idling at the end of the narrow pass, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. As they reached the car, Tiana paused, looking back at the glowing windows of the Moka Café. For a year, that place had been her fortress, a world where she was just a girl with a mop and a forgotten name. Now, it was just a crime scene. "There's no going back, Tiana," Sung-min said, opening the door. "I stopped looking back a long time ago," she replied, her voice steady and cold as the rain. She slid into the leather interior, the door closing with a heavy, pressurized thud that muted the world outside. The car pulled away, melting into the gray vein of the city, leaving nothing behind but the shattered glass of an illusion. The black sedan moved through the rain-slicked arteries of Seoul, a silent shadow cutting through a city of neon. Inside the car, the silence was thick, charged with the adrenaline of the narrowest of escapes. Tiana stared out the window, watching her old life vanish into the blur of gray buildings and glowing billboards. She could still feel the phantom weight of the wooden staff in her hands, a ghost of the violence that had just rewritten her future. The car didn't stop at one of the glittering glass towers of the Gangnam district. Instead, it banked toward the industrial outskirts, where the city grew jagged and the lights became sparse. They arrived at a nondescript warehouse near the docks, its corrugated metal skin weeping rust. As the heavy iron gates rolled shut behind them, the atmosphere shifted from the cold dread of the street to the suffocating heat of a crisis. When they stepped out of the car, a man in a rumpled suit rushed toward Sung-min, his face the color of ash. He didn't even look at Tiana. His eyes were fixed on the blood on his boss's collar. "Sir, it isn't just the cafe," the man stammered, his voice trembling. "They hit the shipping office in Busan. They hit the counting house in Itaewon. They didn't come to steal, sir. They came to burn." Sung-min stopped, his posture stiffening into a line of absolute, frozen fury. He walked toward a bank of monitors at the far end of the warehouse. On the screens, grainy security footage played on a loop. Tiana stood behind him, her eyes narrowing as she watched the flickering images. It was a scorched earth campaign. Men in the same dark coats she had fought in the cafe were moving through Sung-min's properties with incendiary charges, turning years of infrastructure into pillars of fire in mere seconds. This wasn't a tactical strike. It was an erasure. "Who?" Sung-min asked, his voice so quiet it was more terrifying than a shout. "The Kang faction," the aide whispered. "They're saying you've grown soft. They're saying the tiger is just a house cat in a silk suit. They wanted to prove that nowhere you touch is safe anymore." Tiana looked at the screens, then at the man beside her. She saw the tremor in Sung-min's jaw, not of fear, but of a predator being pushed to the edge of his territory. Then she looked down at the phone in the aide's hand. A message had been sent to every contact in Sung-min's network, a single image that made the air in the warehouse turn to ice. It was a photo of the Moka Café, taken from across the street. In the center of the frame, through the window, Tiana was visible, her head lifted, her eyes sharp, the mop handle caught mid-swing. They hadn't just come for Sung-min. They had captured the unknown variable. The silence of the cleaner was gone. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was a target, her face now a trophy in the hands of the man who wanted to burn everything Sung-min touched. The warehouse was a cavern of cold steel and flickering phosphorescence, the hum of the servers sounding like the heartbeat of a dying empire. Sung-min stood before the screens, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of his burning assets. He looked at the image of Tiana, the unknown variable, and then slowly turned to face her. The rage that had darkened his features moments ago had been replaced by something far more dangerous: clarity. "They have your face now," he said, his voice echoing off the corrugated walls. "To the Kang faction, you aren't a woman who was just doing her job. You are the reason their hit failed. You are a symbol of my survival, and they will hunt you until they can use your head to prove I am vulnerable." Tiana stood in the center of the room, her blood-stained apron discarded, wearing the dark, oversized coat like a shroud. She felt the weight of the visibility he described. It was a physical pressure, a heat on the back of her neck. The anonymity that had been her armor for 3 years had been stripped away, leaving her raw and exposed in a city that didn't forgive mistakes. "I can give you a plane ticket," Sung-min continued, taking a step toward her. "I can give you a new name in a city where the rain doesn't smell like Seoul. I can hide you again." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers, looking for the flicker of the soldier he had seen in the cafe. Or I can give you the one thing you've never had in the shadows, agency. Tiana didn't flinch. You want to hire me? No? Sung-min corrected, his tone sharpening, with a sudden, rare respect. I don't need a bodyguard, Tiana. I have men who can take a bullet. I need a partner who can see the world the way you do. Someone who understands that the most effective weapon is the one nobody sees coming. I don't want to own your skill. I want to align with it. He held out a hand, not in a gesture of command, but as an invitation. If you leave, you'll be running for the rest of your life. If you stay, we stop running. We find the man who burned your sanctuary, and we make him regret that he ever looked at the cleaner. Tiana looked at his hand, then up at the screen showing the destruction of his world. She thought of the mop handle breaking, the sound of bone on wood, and the strange electric thrill of finally fighting back. She wasn't a victim of his world. She was the only person in it who knew how to navigate the dark without getting lost. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she stepped forward until she was standing eye to eye with the tiger of Bususan, her posture as grounded and lethal as it had been in the cafe. I don't want your protection, she said, her voice a low, steady vow. And I don't work for kings. But if we're going to hunt, I want to be the one who sets the trap. A slow, grim smile touched Sung-min's lips. It was the first time the mask of the businessman had truly fallen away, revealing the predator beneath. Then let's begin. The warehouse felt smaller than it had an hour ago, the air thick with the static of unspoken suspicions. Sung-min's tactical team moved like ghosts in the periphery, their eyes averted, but Tiana could feel the weight of their judgment. To them, she was a civilian who had seen too much. To her, they were a security perimeter that had already failed once. Sung-min stood before a sprawling digital map of Seoul, his fingers tracing the glowing lines of his supply routes. The Kang faction is ambitious, but they aren't suicidal, he murmured, more to himself than to the room. To hit 3 locations and the cafe in a single night requires more than just muscle. It requires a schedule. They knew where I would be, down to the minute I ordered my coffee. Tiana walked toward the back of the room, where the aide, the man who had delivered the news of the fires, was frantically typing at a workstation. She didn't look at his screen. She looked at his hands. They were trembling, a fine rhythmic vibration that had nothing to do with the cold. The cafe didn't have cameras, Tiana said, her voice cutting through the hum of the computers. The aide froze. Sung-min turned slowly, his gaze narrowing. The photo, Tiana continued, her eyes locked on the back of the aide's neck. The one sent to the network. It was taken from the street, through the window. But the angle was too high for a car, and too steady for a phone. It was a fixed lens, a high-altitude surveillance feed. She stepped closer to the workstation. Sung-min, you told me your security handled the street-level feeds for that block. Who had access to the raw data tonight? The silence that followed was heavy, a physical pressure that seemed to dim the lights. The aide tried to stand, his chair screeching against the concrete floor, but he didn't make it 2 steps. Sung-min was there in a heartbeat, his hand closing around the man's throat, with the casual, terrifying strength of a predator who had finally found the scent of blood. I gave you a home, Sung-min whispered, his voice a jagged edge of betrayal. I gave you my trust. They have my family, the aide gasped, his face turning a mottled purple. Kang, he said if I didn't give him the window, if I didn't send the signal, Sung-min didn't look moved by the plea. He looked disgusted. He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching the traitor's. The moment you chose their lives over mine, you killed them yourself. He didn't finish the man. Not yet. He looked over his shoulder at Tiana, a silent question in his dark eyes. He was seeing if she would flinch at the brutality of his world. Tiana didn't look away. She didn't feel pity. She only saw another layer of the mask falling away. The enemy wasn't just across the city. The enemy was the person standing next to you, holding the door open. He's a lead, Tiana said coldly, her voice devoid of emotion. Don't waste him on revenge. Use him to find out which door they're coming through next. Sung-min's grip tightened for a second before he shoved the man toward his guards. He straightened his silk tie, the tiger once again composed, but his eyes remained on Tiana. The partnership was no longer a theory. It was a necessity. The rain at the docks didn't fall. It shattered against the concrete. The air was thick with the brine of the Incheon coast and the heavy, oily smell of industrial grease. Sung-min's warehouse, which had felt like a fortress minutes ago, was now a kill box. The traitor's information had been a double-edged blade, a lure designed to draw the tiger into the open. The first explosion wasn't a grenade. It was a breach charge that took out the warehouse's western wall. The shockwave tossed Tiana across the floor, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of spinning shadows and white noise. She hit a stack of wooden pallets, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. But the old instincts, the ones forged in a past she had tried to bury, screamed at her to move before her heart could even restart. Through the haze of dust and smoke, she saw them. Not 3 men this time, but a dozen. They moved in tactical formation, their suppressed weapons spitting silent tongues of fire that tore through the server racks. Tiana! Sung-min's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. He was pinned behind the black sedan, his weapon barking back with rhythmic, disciplined fury. He wasn't the polished businessman anymore. He was a man reclaimed by the violence he had tried to leave behind. But he was outnumbered. 2 shooters were flanking his position, their movements synchronized and lethal. Tiana didn't have a gun. She didn't need one. She rolled beneath the chassis of a heavy forklift, her hand finding a 3-foot steel pry bar discarded on the grease-stained floor. It was cold, heavy, and familiar. She moved through the shadows of the shipping containers, like a ghost reclaimed by the night. She emerged behind the first flanking shooter. The steel bar whistled through the damp air, a horizontal strike that shattered the man's knee. As he went down, she pivoted, using the momentum to drive the blunt end of the steel into the second man's throat. No wasted movement, no hesitation. She was a machine of survival, a storm of white apron and cold iron. But then the rhythm broke. A high-caliber round punched through the crate next to her head, showering her in splinters. A second shot caught Sung-min in the shoulder, spinning him back against the car. He went down, his blood dark and steaming against the wet concrete. Tiana froze for a fraction of a second. This was the moment of the choice. The exit was clear, the docks were vast, and the darkness was her oldest friend. She could vanish into the rain and be a ghost again by morning, or she could step into the light of the fire. She looked at Sung-min, who was struggling to sit up, his eyes searching for her through the smoke. He wasn't looking for a savior. He was looking for his partner. Tiana gripped the steel bar until her knuckles ached. She didn't run for the exit. She ran toward the fire. The cleaner was gone. The soldier was back. And the docks were about to run red. The fire from the burning warehouse cast long, jagged shadows across the docks, turning the rain into falling embers. Tiana reached Sung-min as he slumped against the sedan, his hand clamped over the jagged wound in his shoulder. He looked up, his face pale under the flickering orange light, and saw the steel bar in her hand, slick with rain and the dark reality of the night. "Go," he rasped, the word tasting of copper. "The car still runs. Get out of the city." Tiana didn't move. She reached down, her fingers steady as she tore a strip of fabric from her apron and cinched it tight over his wound. The pressure made him hiss, but his eyes never left hers. "I spent 3 years learning how to be invisible," she said, her voice a low, melodic blade. "I thought safety was a place where no one knew my name. I was wrong. Safety is making sure the people who know your name are too afraid to speak it." She looked toward the far end of the pier, where a silver luxury SUV sat idling. The mastermind, Kang, was watching from behind tinted glass, surrounded by the remnants of his private army. He thought he was watching a cleanup crew finish a job. He didn't realize he was watching a transformation. Tiana stood up, her body low and centered, the steel bar held with the practiced grace of a seasoned warrior. Beside her, Sung-min used the car to pull himself to his feet. He spat blood onto the concrete and drew his backup weapon, a compact black pistol that looked like an extension of his own hand. They didn't need to speak. The rhythm was already set. They moved as a single entity, the tiger and the storm. The final confrontation wasn't a chaotic brawl. It was a surgical erasure. Sung-min provided the cover, his shots precise and suppressing, while Tiana moved through the containers like a flicker of moonlight. She was a blur of lethal geometry, the steel bar breaking wrists and crushing windpipes, before the gunman could even register a target. When she reached the silver SUV, she didn't stop. She swung the bar with a primal, rhythmic force, shattering the reinforced glass in a spray of diamonds. Kang sat in the back seat, his face finally reflecting the shock that had started in the cafe. He looked at the woman in the bloodied waitress shirt and saw the end of his empire. "Who are you?" he choked out, his hand reaching for a hidden holster. Tiana leaned into the broken window, her eyes cold enough to freeze the rain. "I'm the one you didn't notice," she whispered. The underworld woke the next morning to a new reality. The Moka Café was a ruin, and the Kang faction had vanished overnight. But in the shadows of Seoul, a new story began to circulate. Not of a lone crime boss, but of a partnership forged in blood and precision. The cleaner hadn't returned to her mop, and the tiger was no longer alone. They had stopped escaping the world and started reshaping it. Tiana Walker was no longer invisible. She was a warning.